All right, so this is going to be just a review of the homework from week 1. Just a review of like data structures, looping through objects, working with arrays, objects. Now this was done in both Ruby and JavaScript for the homework, but I'm just going to do this in JavaScript. So let's look at what we have. So we have some data here. We have 2 users, which are just JavaScript objects with keys, ID, and name. We have 2 restaurants, which are going to be, we have res1 and res2, but these are once again just objects with a little more nested data. These have the keys ID, name, location, which is also another object. We have, delivery days open, likes. We have dishes, which is going to be an array of objects, which inside of here, one object has a name, price, ingredients, and then that ingredients is going to be an array of strings. Then we have reviews, which might have a user ID, which could maybe link back to our user, and then a rating. And then our restaurant 2 is going to look the same. And then down here, I just threw this data into some arrays where I could loop over these. So for this assignment, we don't need to do any interaction with the terminal. Like we don't need to get input from the user. We can just log stuff out to the user. So what I'm going to do here is just get going with these little brain teasers. So first one is I want to access user1 name through user1. So let's first just console.log user1. So user1 is just an object with the key ID and the key name. So if I want to grab the name, I can just do name using JavaScript dot notation. And that grabs us Tony. So then we have this question. What does this output? Res1 dishes. Now this is in Ruby, so let's convert this to what this would be in JavaScript. It would actually be res1.dishes. So this would be how we access it in Ruby as a hash, but since we're doing this in JavaScript, we'll say this, res1.dishes. Well, I could go look at my, before I try to like maybe do that in the console, let's just look at our restaurant 1 and look at the dishes. So here's my restaurant 1. Dishes is actually going to be this whole array of objects. So that is what that is going to output. I'm just going to comment that out. But I could also just test that out, console.log res1, and then grab the dishes. So res1.dishes is itself, it's an array of objects. So there's quite a bit going on here in that one key. Cool. So next step, print out just the name on res1 dishes. So now what we want to do is we want to go through these dishes and just print out the name. So for this, I can use an each loop. And then since this is JavaScript, we're going to be using a for each loop. So let's go ahead and use this. So res1.data for each. Now remember, a for each loop, we just need to pass it a callback function, and it's going to go through each of these things and run this function. So I could call this variable, this parameter dish. So we're going to go through each of our dishes and run this function. And what I just want to do is console.log. Let's just for now console.log the dish. This is not quite going to give us what we want, but it'll kind of show what we're doing. We're going through each of the dishes and we're just going to log the dish. Cool. So here is each of our dishes. And I'm going to comment these ones out as we go along just to clean up our console. See, there's each of our dishes. Sweet. So what I don't want to print out all of these objects. I just want to print out the name. So I'm going to do a dish.name. And what that's going to do is I'm going to go through each of my dishes, but just print out the name. There we go, pad thai and drunken noodle. You know, maybe to make this a little cleaner, I could go leave maybe a message for each of these. Something like that. All right, but I'll just comment that one out since that's done. Sweet. So for the next thing, we want to print out just the name on res1 dishes along with the ingredients. All right, so let's do this again. So let's do a res1 dot dishes dot for each. Once again, go through each of the dish and let's print this out just to see what this looks like again. Now see, we want to go through, each of our dish has a name, but then inside of this dish, there's an array of ingredients. So we want to go through, print the name, but then go through each of the ingredients and print that out. And this is what this is saying. It's going to be a nested each loop. So what I'm going to do inside of here is I could console.log my dish.name and then do like a console.log ingredients. And this is where I want to do a nested for each loop. So I'm going to do dish. So each of my dishes has this ingredients array. Dish.ingredients dot for each. Ingredient. So I'm going to go through each of my ingredients and just, now I can do this console.log ingredient. So here, to maybe format this a little better, I could do something like this. I could say like dish, then log the dish.name. And console.log, you know, has ingredients, spell that right, ingredients. And then we're going to go through each of the ingredients and then list those out. And maybe at the end of this loop, just this might help us see what's going on here. I'm going to do a little dash right here. So dish pad thai has ingredients, noodles, and peppers. So that's going to be, this function is going to run for that first dish, but then there's that inner nested for each that runs through each of that dish's ingredients. And then we'll go to the drunken noodle, we'll run this again, and then run the inner nested loop for the drunken noodles ingredients. And this one, maybe we could even throw in, there's a second argument that we could add here, that is the index. So we could just call that I. And maybe we could interpolate this, you know, do an I plus 1. Let's not do the I plus 1 for now. Let's just leave it at I. And also interpolate ingredient. if we wanted a little more formatting. Oop, looks like I forgot my backtick. See that 0 and 1, if I wanted to add a 1, I could use the index, add 1 to it just to, loop through and give it a count. So dish pad thai has ingredients 1 and 2, noodles, peppers. Dish drunken noodles has ingredients, noodles and chicken. So there's an example of a nested for each loop. Cool. So let's do this. Create a function that takes a user and returns a string with the user's name and ID. So for this one, remember my user looks like this. My user is an object that has an ID and name. And what I want to do is write a function that takes that object, converts it into the string of ID and name, something like that. So let's just write a function, and I'm going to comment out this code right here. So const, let's just call it convert. Let's just call this user to string. So this function is going to take a user, and it should return a string. Now notice it's saying it should return a string. It shouldn't log a string. So this needs to return a string. And I could say something like this, like user.name has ID, user.id. And then I could test this out, const, user1 string equals user2 string, and then pass it the function user, or pass it the object user1. And then we could console.log user1 string. Cool. Run that. Tony has ID 1. Now we could do this with user2 as well. Sally has ID 3. I could also just give this function any object as long as it has an ID and a name. To redeclare that as user3. So now something I might see people do is use console.logs here, because we're kind of switching console.logs and return. So what is the difference? Or let's go over that. So if I do a console.log instead of returning, this function now, let's just run this and see what happens. Because now this function right here, when I call it, it's going to log the string, but what is it going to return? Oh, I didn't save that. Let's save that. Also, I'm missing a parenthesis right there. Cool. So it goes through line 114, 115, 116. Those are these 3 logs. But now these variables, user1, user2, user3, are undefined. So console.logs become less and less, we use them less and less as we start writing code. They more become, tools to help us debug, tools to help us to see what's going on with our code. Normally what we're going to do is we're going to have our functions return values, not just log them. They're going to return values. And then that way we can store whatever this function returns into a variable, and then we can use that variable elsewhere in our code. We can't really use console.log values. They just go to our console and then it's done. So that's why with a lot of these functions, they're not saying, some of them are trying to get us practice to have these actually return values. So this function now returns a value, and then I can store that to a variable and use that variable later in my code. All right, so let's keep going. Create a method that takes a restaurant and returns the menu of that restaurant. Okay, so we'll call this const get menu. So this function takes a restaurant, and it should return the menu of that restaurant. So the menu is essentially just the dishes of this restaurant. So for this, we could just return res.dishes. And then I could say like const, menu equals get menu, and then pass it a restaurant, res1. And we get console.log the menu. Cool. Maybe this would be fine for this, but maybe, like I would maybe want to clean this up a little. So, a little bonus I could do is maybe do a .map. So this is going to, .map is going to return a new array. So I could go through each of my dishes. So I give it a function. Now, whatever this returns is going to be put into this array that the map function is going to return. So I could do something like this. Maybe just a string. So I could do something like this. Because maybe I don't want it to look like this ugly, not ugly, but just this raw data. I could do something like this. I could say like dish name, interpolate that, and then maybe give it a price. So now when I look at my menu, it's an array of strings. So I can go from an array of objects to something that maybe looks a little nicer, like pad thai, and then has the price. Oop, I actually need another $sign right there if I want that a $sign to show up right there. Cool. Or a parenthesis maybe. So I can kind of change how this is formatted. Go from an array of objects to an array of strings, and that might be a little more user-friendly. I think that looks a little better. Cool. The next thing I could do, well, and I think that's good for this one. So it takes the restaurant, returns the menu of that restaurant. All right, let's do the next one. Let's create a function that takes a restaurant and returns the average review. So what we want to do for this one is go through our restaurant reviews and find the average. So const, get average. This is going to take in a restaurant. And so first, let's just console.log the restaurant. Let's just try to find where the reviews is at. Oop, I forgot to call this function. Get average review, and let's pass it restaurant one. Cool. So here's my object. It looks like res.reviews. That's where my reviews are going to be. So let's do console.log res.reviews. Cool. So there's my array of objects that have the rating. So what I need to do is go through these reviews and add them up. And then divide them by however many reviews I have. So I'm going to do this with a for each, but there would be a better way to do this with the reduce, and I'll kind of let you look at that on your own. But let's do this with the for each loop. So I'm going to do a res1.reviews.forEach. So I'm going to go through each review. And for now, just to look at it, let's just console.log the review. This can be a good way to, get this homework done or solve these problems, just to go piece by piece. So now I'm logging through each review. I don't really care about the ID. I just care about the rating. So let's do review.rating and just log those out. Cool. So I can look at this now. I have a 5 and a 3. So I know this should actually just be 8. How did I do that? Well, I added these two numbers up. Oh, sorry, this should be 4, because I add these two numbers up, that's 8, and then I divide them by however long my, however many ratings I have. So let's do that in code. So what I'm going to do is do a const rating sum. I'm just going to set that equal to 0. And then in my loop, I'm going to do a rating sum plus equals, my review rating. And then down here, let's console.log my rating sum. So I start out my sum as 0. I go through each of my reviews and I add to my rating sum the review.rating. Looks like I have an error. Rating sum plus equals rating review. Let's see here. Why does it not like that? Let me try this one more time. Oh, it's a const. This is going to change. Type error assignment to a constant variable. Yes, I do not want this to be a const because this is going to change. So I'm going to make that just a variable that can change. So I'm going to switch const to let right there. Cool. So there's my 8. So that's the sum. But what I want to do is I want to divide this by how many reviews I have, and that's reviews.length. Reviews. Oh, sorry, it's my restaurant.reviews.length. And there we go, 4. But once again, this is me just logging this to the console. It's useful for testing, but it's not going to be really useful as a function. So what I want to do is I want to return this. Because then I can, res1 average. I can get this average, store it into a variable, and then in my app, I could do other stuff with this. Like I could do an if statement. Like if res1 average is greater than, 4.5, say like console.log, yay. But if this function just logs this to the console, then I can't do anything with it. So this is why we're returning things versus logging them to the console. But it's not to say that console.logs are not useful, because now I can do a console.log to see this average being computed correctly. There we go. I could also, get the average of restaurant 2. Let's go look at restaurant 2. That's 2 and 4, so I'm expecting that to be 3. So let's see if that works. Perfect. Cool. So there's that one. Let's comment that out. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to do create an array of restaurants and do CRUD actions on them. So we have our array of restaurants right here, res1 and res2. So what we want to do is CRUD actions. We want to be able to add a restaurant, delete a restaurant, update a restaurant, and show a restaurant. So let's look at that. So let's do a method that takes a restaurant and adds to our array. So let's do a const add restaurant. So this is going to take a restaurant and then our restaurants array, and it's going to add it to the restaurant. This one is a little straightforward. We're just going to do a restaurants dot push restaurant. So then we could just call this function add a restaurant. Now I need to pass this a restaurant. Now restaurant objects are pretty complex, but what I'll do is I'll just copy one of these, restaurant 2. So I'll make this a little smaller. Cool. So I'll just copy restaurant 2. Let's make this a little different. 3. This, I don't know. Wendy's. Burger. Fries. This really isn't that important, but we come through, we create another restaurant object. So now I should just be able to take that restaurant and add it here. Looks like I might have a syntax error here somewhere. Curly bracket on this restaurant 3 I just created. So now I can go through and I can push that restaurant onto my restaurants array. So here I could do a console.log just to see this being changed. I can console.log. Let's just do like restaurants.length. And then I'm going to add the array or add the restaurant, and then I'll log it here. See if that worked. So I'd expect this to be 2, then I add the restaurant, and then I could see it being 3. Looks like I have an error. Where is it? Push, cannot read push of undefined. So what this is saying is that this is undefined because when I call my function, I pass it restaurant 3, but I actually don't pass it my restaurants array. So this is my function definition. I could call this, X and Y, but what I want to do is I want to take one restaurant and then my restaurants array. Here I actually call it and pass the actual values. And I was forgetting this second argument right there, so I can now call this function again. Oop, I forgot to save it. There we go. So I have a function that takes a restaurant, pushes it on. So there's my adding a restaurant. So a read method. Let's do a method that displays all restaurant info. So let's do a const, res2 string, or let's call this restaurant, info, restaurant info. So this will take an array of restaurants. We'll go through each of our restaurants and we'll print out some information about these. So we'll just kind of make up something here. Say something like, my restaurant has a name, .name. Is in, let's format the location, restaurant.location.city. Just kind of making up some stuff here. So I have my restaurant.name is in location. So right now I would expect this to say something like, Alberto's is in Salt Lake. Let's just run this for now, see if it's working. Oop. Once again, let's comment this out. I need to actually call this function. Let's pass it the restaurants to call it. So Spicy Thai is in SLC, Alberto's is in SLC. I could even use, and is open. Let's interpolate that res dot, what was it? Days open. So I could keep building out this string, but that's kind of the point. Just go through this array and, kind of use some of this information to print out, about my restaurant. So I could go through my array of restaurants, use a for each loop to log information about the restaurant. Cool. So let's do a update method now. So let's take a method that takes in a restaurant and updates that to your array. Now there's a lot of different ways we could do this. So let's do it like this. Let's have it be kind of like our add method. But the one change I'm going to do here, let's just give this an index of the restaurant we want to update. So I could take my restaurants, then index, and then set that equal to the restaurant that was passed. And we could now have this be update restaurant. I'm going to comment this one out. So now I could call my function update restaurant. Let's pass it that restaurant 3 again. Let's pass it my restaurants array. And then let's update index 0. So what essentially I'm going to do is I'm going to go through my arrays and update the first index to be restaurant 3. So we could do like a console.log, my restaurants before and after the update. So see, here it is after, there's the Wendy's, but before it's Alberto's and Spicy Thai. So I go through and I update that array of restaurants. Cool. So that'd be one way to do that. Another way that you might think about doing that is maybe I just have a function that's like update restaurant name, where I don't actually go update the whole restaurant. Maybe I'm just update one attribute of it. So I could take in my array of restaurants, but maybe like the name. And so I could say restaurant.index.name equals what was ever passed here. So this could be another way I could update my array of data, is maybe I just go through and I update one field of my restaurants. So if I call this one, just copy this stuff. I'm going to comment this out. So I'll log the restaurants. But then maybe what I want to do is, did I spell that wrong? Is here, I'm not going to update the whole restaurant. I'm just going to be like, change the name of the restaurant. Oops, sorry. I have the name as the first argument. Need to kind of follow this. So that's the new name. Now I need to actually pass in my array. And then the index of the restaurant I'm going to update. So now if I run, I think Alberto's is the second one, so I'll change that to a 1. So let's change this to update restaurant name. Run that. So you can see beforehand the name of the first index, or the restaurant with the index of 1 is Alberto's. Then after I run my function, I update just the name. Now we're going to get a lot more into updating. This is kind of a pretty basic way to update, but this is kind of just a brief intro into, the CRUD actions of creating, reading, updating, and destroying. Cool. So that's another way you could have solved that one. All right, so let's do this last one of a delete. So a method that deletes a restaurant from your array. Const delete restaurant. So how I'm going to have this one work is I'm going to have this one take an index. Or sorry, let's have this take an ID. I want this to remove the ID of the restaurant in my array. And let's also do pass it to restaurants. So what I want to do is I want to go through my restaurants and find the restaurant where I'm given that ID. So let's first do that. So I'm going to do a restaurants, and there's a find index method. So what I can do here is I can go through each of my restaurants. And I can say, hey, does the restaurant.id, does it equal the ID that was passed to this function? And if it does, it's going to return the index. So let's see if we can get this working. So what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to, for now, test this out in console.log the index. Let's maybe name this index to delete. So let's see, I want to delete, let's say we want to delete Alberto's. Alberto's has ID 2. Now this is not the index, this is a key. I want to match this ID. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, hey, delete restaurant, delete the restaurant with ID 2. Let's pass it the restaurants array. And let's just call this. Now this one right now is just logging the index to delete. We're just kind of doing some incremental programming. See if we can get that index. So this is returning -1. If this function cannot find a match, it returns -1. But I'm kind of expecting the restaurant, those two to match. So let's do a console.log here of my restaurant. See what that is. And in particular, I want to do a res.id. So 1 and 2. Well, something I'm actually forgetting here is that this function that I passed, this find index. So here I'm passing a function because I do have this ID 2 here. And look, let's also just log this statement right here. That actually returns true. So what I need to do is I need to go through, I actually need to return that function right there. So if I put the return keyword right there, then I do get the index. So now that I have the index to delete, now I can do my restaurants and call the delete at function, I believe it's called, index to delete. So that is not the function. So I'm going to have to Google this. Delete index JavaScript. I'm gonna have to use the slice. The delete at method I'm thinking of is Ruby. I don't know if the JavaScript has a nice delete index method. So I think we're gonna have to do this with the splice. So the splice, I tell it the index. Let me just see this one more time. Remove index and then array JavaScript. And we gotta use the splice. I think if we use the splice and then the index and then tell it 1, that will just remove one item. So let's do that. The index.splice, let's give it the index to delete and just say delete one thing. So what we'll need to do with this, it's console.log our restaurants before we delete one, console.log our restaurants after we delete one. And there we go. So there's our first one without Alberto, with Alberto's, and then we delete it, and now it's gone. So yeah, those are the challenges. Just some practice. Go through this and see if this makes sense, and do this in JavaScript for some practice.